It's One Nation Restorations, and we're restoring another American-made tool with American-made tools. The inventory of the parts that need to be fixed on this Rodac 1970 straight line sander include the cylinder assembly that's dragging on the housing, the O-rings are all dried out, the decal's unreadable, the exterior looks every bit of 50 years old, but the biggest issue that it has is all of the bearings inside are completely shot. The sanding pad came out without any problems, and the underside looks to be in great shape. The handle is attached by 4 socket screws, and they have their standard rust, but the handle is made of aluminum so it can't rust. The sander itself has a 3/8 fitting on the back end, which I've never really seen go bad, so I'll probably just buff it out for cosmetics and it'll go right back on. Getting inside the handle, I found that the throttle valve, spring, and spring seat all seem to be in working condition, but the 2 O-rings were dried out and need to be replaced. Underneath the drive board, there are 6 screws that are attached to nuts with locking washers. I wouldn't recommend trying to untighten these screws because you will definitely strip them out. The locking washer, rotor, and cylinder assembly move way too easily, which is a telltale sign of just how shot these bearings are. It's impossible to keep out all the dirt and water from years of sanding. Once it gets inside, it's going to create friction and heat, which is going to lead to pitting and failure. Even if they're properly maintained, they're not meant to last for 50 years, not in a car, bike, or a flat sander. Here you'll see some of the issues with the cylinder assembly. The rust around the outside is a combination of not getting used and not properly oiling before use. It's hard to find a 50-year-old tool that wasn't hung out to dry at some point in its lifetime. The balancer seems to be in great shape, but you can see some rust on the cylinder and inside where the rotor spins. The end plates have some pitting and will need to be buffed out after some de-rusting solution. Pay attention to the direction of the vanes for the rotor because this is going to be important for allowing the fluid to be pumped in and out. And the last thing to do is to take the bearing off of the shaft. This is our first look at just how bad the bearings are. You give it a couple flicks of the finger, it shouldn't move like this. Overall, I'm pretty excited to tackle this restoration. I have several Rodac pneumatic tools that are made in America from the 70s and 80s. They're pretty easy to track down, but this one by far is in the worst shape of all of them. So I'm pretty motivated to see it back to its original form. I think the bulk of the work here is going to be spent on cosmetics, but there's still plenty of work here that has to be done mechanically to get this thing back to the shape that it was. I wasn't sure how polished this piece came from the factory, so I have to look under the decal for a clue to that. I couldn't find any of these 800 models online. A lot of times I'll go find a catalog of the exact version, but the 8100 model is pretty much all I can find online. That dual piston is just much more common to come across. And even though this decal was totally wrecked, it still hurt me a little bit to peel it off. And now that the decal is gone, you can see that it has a light polish. Not a professional or a high gloss look, but just enough to make me work for it. When I originally bought this from my neighbor who scored it from an estate sale, I thought it was going to get a red paint job like the rest of my Rodac tools, but it turns out they didn't start painting them to that iconic Rodac red until the late 70s or early 80s. Now, right out of the gate, I tried a 1000 grit wet sand because I wanted to see if I could match what was underneath the decal. Now, it turns out I needed a much higher grit than that, but from the 1000, I backed off grits, so I tried not to go straight to the 40 anyways. So my goal was essentially to avoid the lower grits if I didn't have to go that far because I knew I didn't have to polish completely like a professional look. Now I eventually made it all the way back down to 40, but only in some of the spots, so it turns out it wasn't for nothing. The problem was actually pitting. There were 2 small pits that I left even in this piece. You have to weigh out whether it's worth going down that far and having a low spot, because when you're doing exposed metal like this, you can't go back and put in filler. Once it's gone, it's gone. And so it turns out I gave this thing the regular treatment for polishing. Dry sanding from 40 to 320 and then wet sanding from 320, overlapping that all the way up to 2500. I followed that with 3 pads for the buffing. I did a firm pad, then medium and soft, spending less and less time at each one of those stations. And the last tip that I'll leave you with for sanding is to do it at 90 degrees for each grit that you change or each round of sanding that you do. And this is going to dramatically help you with miss spots for your sanding and prevent you from having to retrace any of the steps that you do. It'll make the lines pop for each one of those stations, if that makes sense. But you still have to keep your eye on it. You have to zoom in for each one of those levels. And if you see any scratches, you've got to go back and retrace. I promise there's nothing more defeating than getting all the way to the polish stage just to have the polish make those scratches that you missed pop out. It's too late. If this tip or any other ideas have helped you with your restorations, join the channel by subscribing for more videos helping you restore your American tools. With the bulk of the work finished on the main housing, I can now polish the rest of the interior components. The sanding phase gave me time to let these parts soak in evapor rust, and it also gave me time to get the brand new bearings I ordered shipped here. My lead time on the decals is a couple weeks, so I don't even start projects unless I already have them there. Now these parts went through several phases before they were ready to go. Obviously the evapor rust, but then I hit them with a light sandpaper. It was about 1,000 grit. And then from there, I hit them with a buffer. I spent far less time restoring these small parts than I had to for the big body. It wasn't even close today. And then the only thing that I have left is to get them soaking into a fine oil. Now I put them into a jar of 3M oil and I let them soak for a little bit before pulling them out and kind of tamping off some of the excess oil before assembly. The sanding pad assembly just needed some light sanding. I started with 1,000 grit and then I brought it over to the buffing wheel just for a little light dusting. Now I did replace the gasket for the handle of the sander. It's pretty old and it was cork, so I do recommend changing that. They're not really reusable. You can get away with it sometimes if they're rubber gaskets and they're new enough, but I typically will just buy a new one. Now, they don't make these gaskets anymore, so I had to custom make this. I just bought a roll of it at your local hardware or your local auto parts store, and you just cut it out and you're good to go. It's now time for the reassembly, and your bearing is going to go on the shaft first. You'll need to press this on, or you could use a soft mallet and lightly tap evenly around the bearing so that it goes on true. Be sure to oil all the parts inside the cylinder assembly because you don't want a dry startup in the initial setup. It's also a good idea to double check the directions of the vanes, so I advise you to either record your removal process or write down the orientation of the assembly when you do it. The shaft balancer is the last part to go on before you install it into the main body. It has far less play now in the parts than it did before it got the new bearings, and now that it's been derusted, that's making a huge difference in this piece. Now, the shaft balancer has a socket screw on it that tightens onto the shaft. You have to align the groove that's on that shaft where it goes with the inlet hole. And if you don't do that, the screw's going to stick out and it's going to hit the other screws as it spins around, which is going to leave some shrapnel and lead to failure down the line. Now the sanding pad has 13 screws that mount it to the housing, along with 13 locking washers and 13 nuts, for a total of 39 total small parts that are begging to be lost or mixed up during installation. So now I use a baggie and post-it method to keep track of and organize all of my parts to prevent this. Even the handle got its own baggie because of how many small parts that go into it. I was genuinely excited about how this thing turned out because that black coat of paint pops and the trigger functions like it has a new throttle valve and a spring inside of it. And like I said before, it's getting a new hose fitting, but I'm sure yours is fine if you want to reuse yours. The female couplings are usually the area that fails first in these types of setups. But either way, whether you're installing the new one or you're using the piece that was on this when you found it, you're going to want to use some Teflon tape around the threads to prevent any extra air leaks. The straight line sanders put a huge demand on compressors as they are, and you don't want to add to this issue by having extra air come out of the back of the handle. And the front handle is the last part to go back on this piece, and then you're going to want to get it back to show quality. It was there when you got it off the buffing wheel, but between touching it with your gloves, 2 different sets, and your hands, it doesn't stand a chance. But it's not just about how it looks. It's about its performance when it comes to the decal. The decal will not adhere if you leave any oil behind, so you have to make sure you remove it. Now, I used a brake parts cleaner to get this off, but now that I've stripped all the oil off, I then have to come back and follow up with another oil so that this thing doesn't rust out. This project took 13 hours to complete, and 7 of that was from sanding and polishing. My favorite part of this project was the way that the decal looks on the finished product. You can't beat that. Be sure to watch some of my other videos. We restored another American-made tool with American-made tools. See you next time.